Imagine living in a world where refusing to sit down could take 15 minutes, where holding someone's hand required official permission, where leaving a party could literally get you imprisoned by your host, where police officers announce themselves to criminals with trumpets, and where breaking the rules of courtesy could get you executed. Welcome to the courts of the late Middle Ages, where etiquette wasn't about being polite. It wasn't about making people comfortable. It was about power, honor, and survival, and it was absolutely, utterly insane. In the 15th century, European nobles turned courtesy into a blood sport. They spent more time arguing about who should walk through a door first than they did actually fighting wars. They wept real tears over the proper way to greet a guest. They held court cases that lasted over a decade about who elbowed whom at church. And the consequences for breaking these rules, they ranged from social death to actual death. Today, we're diving into the most absurd, the most elaborate, and the most dangerous etiquette battles of the Middle Ages. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll never complain about awkward dinner parties again. Imagine this. You're invited to a royal banquet in the Duchy of Burgundy. You've traveled for days. You arrive hungry, excited, ready to feast on roasted peacocks and swan and boar. The great hall glimmers with candle light reflecting off silver goblets. Tapestries hang from stone walls. Musicians tune their instruments. But before anyone can eat, before a single bite is taken, two nobles have to decide who sits first. Sounds simple, right? One's higher ranking, so he sits first. Done. 5 seconds. Wrong. Dead wrong. Because in the late Middle Ages, refusing an honor wasn't just polite. It was the ultimate power move. The longer you refused, the more respect you commanded. The more you protested your unworthiness, the more worthy you appeared. It was competitive humility, and everyone was playing to win. So these two men would stand there bowing so deeply their foreheads nearly touched the floor. "No, my lord, you must sit first. I am unworthy of such honor." "Absolutely not, dear cousin. The honor must be yours." I could never presume, back and forth, over and over for up to 15 full minutes. While this happened, the roasted peacock congealed on the table. The wine warmed in the goblets. Musicians played the same tune 3 times, and everyone else just waited, hungry, watching. This wasn't a quirk of a few eccentric nobles. This was mandatory protocol observed across every court in France, Burgundy, and beyond. The contemporary chronicler Gore Chasselang wrote about these refusals with reverent detail, describing them as displays of true nobility. Because at medieval courts, humility wasn't just a virtue. It was currency, status, power, and everyone was competing to be the most humble person in the room. When the young Philip, the beautiful Archduke of Austria, visited the Spanish court, he knew the rules. Custom demanded he kiss the Queen of Spain's hand. Simple enough, except the Queen, determined to demonstrate her own humility, hid her hand behind her back. Philip waited politely, made the gesture of reaching for her hand. She kept it hidden. He waited some more, bowing, making all the proper sounds of respect. She still refused. This went on and on, the entire court watching, fascinated, wondering who would break first. Then Philip, young and frustrated and apparently done with the game, suddenly grabbed her hand and kissed it anyway. The entire Spanish court exploded in laughter. Not scandalized laughter, not shocked gasps, delighted laughter, because someone had finally cut through the absurd ritual, and they could all breathe again. The Queen herself was laughing, but the laughter had an edge. She hadn't been expecting it. She'd been out, maneuvered in the courtesy game. It was brilliant. It was scandalous, and it became the talk of both courts for months. But my favorite example, the one that really shows how insane this got, involves Duke Philip the Good of Burgundy and his cousin, the Dauphin of France. In 1456, the Dauphin, the future King Louis XI, fled his father's court during a bitter family conflict and sought refuge in Philip's territory. Philip was in the middle of a military campaign, literally besieging a city. But the moment he heard his royal cousin had arrived, he abandoned the siege, left his army standing there confused, and raced back to Brussels at breakneck speed. Not because of political strategy, because of protocol. Philip was absolutely terrified that the Dauphin would come out to meet him first. Because if the Dauphin, heir to the throne of France, showed Philip that honor, Philip would be humiliated forever. He would be the duke who let a prince come to him instead of rushing to the prince. The shame would be unerasable. So, Philip traveled at desperate speed, sending messenger after messenger ahead, practically begging, "Tell him to stay inside. Tell him to wait. If he comes out to meet me, I'll turn around and ride so far he'll never find me." Think about that. A powerful duke, one of the richest men in Europe, abandoning a military campaign and riding in terror. Not of battle, not of assassination, but of being greeted too warmly. When they finally met in the palace courtyard, it was pure theater. Philip rushed forward, tore off his hat, threw himself to his knees, and tried to prostrate himself. Dauphin tried desperately to stop him, reaching down to pull him up, saying, "No, no, please rise." The Duchess of Burgundy physically held the Dauphin back to keep him from taking another step forward. And then, this is in the historical record, both men began to weep, real tears streaming down their faces, tears of emotional overwhelm at the sheer weight of showing proper respect. And all the nobles watching them, they wept too. The entire courtyard full of armored knights and silk-clad ladies sobbing at the beauty of the moment. This wasn't a funeral. This wasn't a tragedy. This was greeting between cousins, and it reduced dozens of battle-hardened warriors to tears. This was peak medieval theater. This was what passed for normal at the most refined courts in Europe. Now you might think, okay, the nobles were obsessed with formality when it came to big ceremonial moments, but surely friendship was natural, right? Surely people could just hold hands if they wanted to. Wrong again. At the Burgundian court, even gestures of affection were choreographed down to the last detail. It was precisely prescribed which ladies had to walk together holding hands, not which ladies could, which ladies had to, and the rules dictated who should make the first move, who should issue the invitation, and in what manner. They even had a technical term for it, hoocher. It meant the ritual wave or call that invited someone to take your hand. Imagine needing a special vocabulary word just to ask someone to hold your hand. Imagine being a lady at court, walking through a garden and wanting to link arms with your friend, but you can't, not yet. You have to wait for the proper moment. You have to check the social hierarchy. You have to make sure you're using the right gesture, the right words, the right tone. What should have been spontaneous warmth became another performance in the endless medieval stage play. A court lady who described the Burgundian protocols in detail wrote about hoocher with the same reverence that a priest might describe a religious sacrament. To her, these weren't silly rules. They were the framework of civilization itself. Without them, she believed society would collapse into chaos. And maybe she wasn't entirely wrong, because this was a world of terrifying violence, and these elaborate rituals were the only thing standing between order and bloodshed. But here's where things get darker. Medieval hospitality wasn't about making guests comfortable. It was about control, about demonstrating power. And once you entered a noble's home, you belonged to them, even if you were a queen. The wife of King Louis Roman XI learned this the hard way. She was invited to stay with Duke Philip of Burgundy for a few days, a pleasant visit among royals, a chance to strengthen family bonds. Everything seemed cordial and proper. But when the time came to leave, when her husband, the king, had specifically ordered her return on a certain day, the Duke refused to let her go. She begged. Her attendants pleaded with him, explaining that the king would be furious. She herself told him she was terrified of her husband's rage, that Louis was not a forgiving man, that she would face serious consequences. The Duke smiled warmly and said no. Etiquette demanded that a generous host never releases a guest too soon, so she stayed day after day, a prisoner wrapped in silk and courtesy. There was nothing she could do about it. To physically force her way out, to demand her freedom, to make a scene would be to commit an unforgivable breach of etiquette. Better to face her husband's fury than to insult her host in his own home. Better to risk a royal marriage than to violate the sacred rules of hospitality. This wasn't kindness. This wasn't generosity. This was a power game dressed up in velvet and smiles, medieval courtesy at its finest, where please stay really meant you have no choice. The obsession with refusing honor didn't stop at doorways and greetings. It poisoned every aspect of daily life, especially meals and church services. At dinner, hosts would insist with elaborate flourishes, "Please have more. I beg you." Guests would refuse with equal drama. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly. You're too kind, but I insist truly. You honor me, but no, I must decline." This could go on for half an hour. The meal wasn't about eating, it wasn't about nourishment or pleasure. It was about staging an elaborate performance of mutual generosity. Nobody dared appear greedy, but nobody dared offend the host by refusing either, so they just argued endlessly about bread, about wine, about whether to take a second helping of roasted meat. The food grew cold. The servants stood frozen, holding platters, unsure whether to serve or wait, and the guests grew hungrier and more irritable, trapped in a courtesy prison of their own making. When you finally left a medieval feast, you left exhausted not from eating, but from arguing about eating. But the real chaos happened in church during the offertory, when congregation members were supposed to place their donations on the altar. Nobody wanted to go first because going first might look proud, might suggest you thought yourself important enough to lead. So nobles would stand there in the aisle whispering urgently to each other, "You go." "No, I shall not." "After you, dear cousin." "Absolutely not." "You must." "I refuse." The priest would stand at the altar waiting, watching while the liturgy ground to a halt. A medieval poet captured the absurdity perfectly. He wrote a verse where a young woman is handed the offertory basket. "Take it." "I shall not, my lady." "Yes, do take it, dear friend." "Certainly, I shall not take it. People would think me a fool." "Pass it." "To Miss Maroda." "I shall not." "Jesus Christ forbid." "Pass it to the ladeyard." On and on through a whole roster of names, each woman refusing, each passing the burden to someone else until finally someone gave in out of sheer exhaustion and social pressure. Then came the kiss of peace. After the Agnus Dei, a small plate called lee made of wood or silver or ivory was passed around for people to kiss. It was meant to symbolize Christian unity. Instead, it became another battlefield. Each person would refuse to kiss it first, insisting their neighbor should have the honor. The plate would sit there, getting passed back and forth while the mass stalled. Sometimes this went on for 10 minutes, sometimes 15. The priest standing at the altar, the choir waiting to sing, everyone watching the nobles play their courtesy games. Contemporary writers complained that this had become a standard and protracted disturbance of church services. Think about that. The kiss of peace meant to show Christian love had become such a problem that it regularly disrupted worship. Even holy ceremonies couldn't escape the madness of medieval etiquette. Even in the house of God, nobles were more concerned with appearing humble than with actually praying. Now you might think, surely in battle, this nonsense stopped, right? Surely when lives were at stake, when armies faced each other across muddy fields, practicality won out. You would be wrong. Just before the Battle of Creil in 1346, one of the most important battles of the 100 Years' War, 4 French knights rode out to scout the English Positions, they were experienced warriors. They had critical intelligence about enemy numbers, positions, formations, information that could decide the battle. They returned and pushed through the crowd of soldiers to reach King Philip VI of France. The king, impatient and anxious, rode forward to meet them. "What news do you have, Sus?" he demanded. The knights looked at each other. Silence. "Well, speak." More silence. None of them wanted to speak first. Because speaking first meant putting yourself above your comrades, meant claiming the right to address the king before them. So they started debating right there with the king staring at them in disbelief. "Sire, you tell him, no, no, you speak to the king. I will not go ahead of you, but neither shall I." Back and forth, while the entire French army waited, while the English army prepared, while precious minutes ticked away. Finally, exasperated beyond measure, the king just ordered one of them to speak. The chronicler Jean Froissart, who recorded this scene, noted dryly that practicality had to give way to beautiful form. They lost the battle, by the way, badly. Thousands of French knights died, but at least those 4 scouts maintained proper courtesy. Here's the thing about rigid etiquette. It's a dam holding back an ocean of violence, and sometimes that dam breaks. At the coronation banquet of Charles VI in 1380, Duke Philip of Burgundy arrived to claim his rightful seat between the king and the Duke of Anjou. But someone was already sitting there. Philip didn't ask politely. He didn't request clarification. He forced his way in, physically shoving his way to his proper place. Instantly, both noble families rushed forward, shouting, threatening, hands on swords. The great hall of the palace, moments before, filled with music and ceremony, was seconds away from becoming a massacre. The king's own coronation, about to be baptized in blood. Only the king himself, barely more than a boy, managed to intervene and order everyone to stand down. Philip got his seat, but the incident was remembered for decades as an example of how quickly honor could turn to violence, how fragile the peace really was beneath all the silk and ceremony. During a mass in 1492 at Notre Dame in Paris, 2 canons got into a fight with the Archbishop of Sens over a question of precedence. The Archbishop was blessing the crowd after the service, walking in procession with his ceremonial cross carried ahead of him. The canons from Notre Dame, who resented the Archbishop's authority over their church, decided to make a statement. They rushed forward with a group of supporters. They grabbed the ceremonial cross and damaged it. They twisted the hand of the priest carrying it until he cried out in pain. When the Archbishop tried to stop them, tried to calm the situation, they turned on him. The dean of the cathedral elbowed him hard in the stomach. Others tore at his ceremonial vestments, ripping his hat, tearing the ribbons. Another canon chased him through the church, shouting insults, pointing his finger in his face, grabbing his arm so violently it tore his robes. He nearly punched a senior archbishop in church during Mass in front of the king. The result, a lawsuit that lasted 13 years. 13 years of legal proceedings over who had the right to carry a cross where. And then there's my personal favorite example of what happened when etiquette went wrong. John, the fearless Duke of Burgundy, one of the most powerful nobles in France, was walking through Paris one day when he encountered a man in official robes. John, always courteous, always aware of protocol, greeted him warmly, shook his hand, exchanged pleasantries. Only later did someone inform him that was Capellouche, the public hangman of Paris. John had shaken a hangman's hand in public where people saw. The humiliation was unbearable, the stain on his honor unerasable. In medieval society, executioners were considered, spiritually, contaminated. Touching one was social poison, so John had the man killed, not arrested, not fined, not publicly shamed, killed. Because touching a hangman's hand was a stain that could only be washed away with blood. This is what medieval courtesy really was. A beautiful, ornate prison holding back chaos and murder. And when someone violated the rules, even accidentally, violence was always waiting just beneath the surface. So what was the point of all this? Why did medieval nobles waste hours arguing about who should sit first, hold hands second, or kiss a plate third? Why did they trap guests in their homes and weep over proper greetings? Why did they delay battles and disrupt church services and spend years in lawsuits over who stood where? Because they lived in a world of terrifying, constant violence, a world where insults led to blood feuds that lasted generations, where honor could be lost in a moment and never recovered, where the wrong gesture could start a war. These elaborate rituals, as absurd as they seem to us, were how they tried to control that violence. Every bow, every refusal, every tear-stained greeting was an attempt to prove they were civilized, that they were better than the chaos surrounding them, that they could transform raw power into grace and beauty. It didn't always work. The violence broke through anyway in brawls at coronations, in fights during Mass, in executions over handshakes. But for a while, in those frozen moments of competitive humility, they could pretend. They could pretend they lived in a world of grace and beauty instead of blood and madness. They could pretend that elaborate ceremony made them different from the soldiers butchering each other in muddy fields. They could pretend that spending 15 minutes refusing a chair somehow elevated them above the brutality of their age. The autumn of the Middle Ages, where courtesy was combat, friendship was scripted, and hospitality could be a prison sentence, where nobles would rather delay a battle than speak out of turn, and where the most dangerous insult wasn't a slap to the face, but offering someone a chair before they were ready to sit down. Makes modern etiquette look pretty simple, doesn't it?